Hi, I'm Chris Teutsch, Forage Extension Specialist at the University of Kentucky's Research and Education Center located in Princeton, Kentucky. And I'm going to be talking about watering systems for small ruminants today. And we've divided this presentation up into three parts. The first part is going to look at the water requirements and layout considerations for setting up a watering system for small ruminants. The first thing we want to talk about is water quality. And when I talk about water quality, it's for both livestock and quality in terms of the environment. Whenever we get livestock in or around water sources, we have the potential to contaminate those water sources with urine and manure. And that can increase nitrate levels, can cause diseases, can be a source of parasites. And small ruminants in particular tend to be a little more picky about the quality of the water that they're drinking, so that could potentially decrease water intake if it's a low quality water source. Now, how water quality impacts animal performance is not well understood. We always assume that improved water quality is going to result in improved animal performance, and it certainly could, but we don't have a lot of good data to prove that. We're going to increase things like average daily gains or weaning weights in livestock. But common sense tells us that we want to supply as clean and as fresh a water to livestock as possible. We also want to make sure that we're not degrading environmental quality. The way that we set up a watering system can actually have a positive impact on water quality overall. So let's move right into water requirements of different livestock classes. There's a number of factors impacting the water requirements of livestock, and probably one of the biggest ones is how much moisture is in the feed or the ration that they're receiving. So, for example, if animals are eating predominantly dry hay, they're going to have a higher requirement for extra water in the terms of a watering system because there's not much moisture in that dry hay versus fresh forage that might be 80% moisture in that fresh forage. So what they're eating can impact how much water they're going to need to drink to get their daily water requirement. Air temperature can have a major impact. When we go from 50 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, the water requirement approximately doubles for most classes of livestock. Breed can have an impact. Not a lot of good information for small ruminants, but European breeds tend to have a higher water requirement than tropical breeds for beef cattle. And breeds that are dairy versus meat tend to have a higher water requirement. So stage of production. So if an animal's lactating, so she's producing milk, she's going to have a higher water requirement than an animal that's dry. And then one that we don't commonly think about but can impact how much water animals consume is if that water is readily accessible. So if we have a water that's good, clean, fresh water in each paddock, animals are going to drink about 15% more than if they had to walk a long distance to get to water. So let's take a look at some water requirements. When we're thinking about setting a watering system up, what we want to do is estimate water requirements or how much water is going to be needed in that watering system. And we want to do that for the highest potential water requirements. That's going to be probably right in the middle of the summer when conditions are hot and those animals are consuming the maximum amount of water. We also want to think about future expansion. So if I want to further subdivide my pastures, or maybe I want to fence in another 25 or 30 acres or 40 acres, we need to think about that and how much water will be needed for that future expansion. And this is just a table of water requirements at 50 and 90 degrees for different livestock classes. If we look, for example, at 40 beef cows, so I've got a beef cow herd of 40 cows, and I'm going to estimate for the highest water need, that will be at 90 degrees. That's about 30 gallons a day. That's going to give us a daily water requirement. So we'll need to be able to provide around 1,200 gallons of water per day. Now, for small ruminants, something like 50 ewes, if we look at their maximum water requirements, it's going to be about 4 gallons a day per ewe, and that's going to come out to be about 200 gallons of water per day. So with this table and knowing how many animals you have, you can kind of get an idea of how much water you're going to be able to supply in a given watering system, or how much is going to be required in a day for a given watering system. I want to spend just a little time talking about locating watering points, because this is so critical in setting up a watering system that's going to be effective and allow for future expansion. So it's extremely important when we think about rotational stocking and how we're going to set pastures up and how we're going to move animals through that system. We want to make sure that we have the watering points in the right place, and that will facilitate us using improved grazing management. We want to allow for flexibility, so we want to be able to change how we graze those pastures, and we also want to allow for future expansion. So if we want to make more subdivisions, or we want to fence in another field, we need to think about where we locate those watering points at in the system. Generally speaking, we want good drainage, so both internal drainage, which means the water will move through the soil and drain away, but also good surface drainage. So a place that we don't want to locate a watering point would be in a low spot in the pasture where water would fill in and kind of stay around there. We want to locate those on a crown or a side slope or of a hill, so that the water drains away from that watering point. We want travel distance to be less than 800 feet. I'm going to show you why with this diagram right here. So on the y-axis, we have pasture utilization rate, so how much of the pasture they actually graze, and on the x-axis, we have distance from the water source. So what we see is when we get past 800 feet, so if you look right here at 800 feet, when we get past there, the pasture utilization trails off very quickly. So when animals have to walk further than 800 feet, they tend to graze less of that pasture area. So we want to have our waters located within 800 feet of the furthest point in that pasture. And that will help us maintain decent pasture utilization. And I will point out, this data was done at the University of Missouri, and it was not done with small ruminants. It was done with beef cattle. We don't have a lot of good watering data with small ruminants per se. So let's talk a little more about locating watering points. I'm just going to go through some examples. So this is one big pasture, and what we can do is we want to try to keep our watering point in the center of each paddock. So if we subdivide this large pasture into 4 smaller subdivisions, the ideal place to locate the water would be in the middle of each one of those subdivisions. And what that allows us to do is come back in and we can further subdivide that subdivision in the future. So we could use that single watering point in the center of that subdivision to make 4 further subdivisions, because we've located that watering point in the center of that paddock. And we want that maximum distance from that water to be 800 feet or less. A lot of times we'll share a waterer between 2 pasture subdivisions. And this is done to help reduce expense in terms of having half as many waterers as the previous example. Is this as good as the previous example? Probably not, because it doesn't allow for as good of subdivisions. So if we subdivide this, we can subdivide this into 2, and then all of a sudden, for the same paddock, we're greater than 800 feet from the furthest point in that subdivision. So not the ideal situation, but a lot of times we work in less than ideal conditions. Okay, so here's a third example, same pasture area, but we put 1 waterer right in the middle. That allows for 4 subdivisions, but again, that distance is much greater than 800 feet. And what that means is, as we get out past 800 feet, the utilization of this portion of the pasture is going to be much less. And that's really important to remember. So where we locate our watering points is really important. Ideally, we want to locate the watering point in the center of each subdivision. So that's the end of the first part on watering systems for small ruminants. I'd invite you to watch parts 2 and 3.